Russia maintains a large military force on the border of Ukraine and has deployed troops on exercise to Belarus. By deploying these forces, Putin knowingly raised the stakes politically and militarily. Russia considers NATO's eastern expansion as a breach of an agreement. In September 1990, Gorbachev signed the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, which saw the reunified Germany a full sovereign state and NATO member. The discussions between the US and Russian Federation following the breakup of the Soviet Union are remembered very differently in Moscow and Washington. Gorbachev remembered that the Americans promised that NATO wouldn't move beyond the boundaries of Germany after the Cold War. The U.S. Secretary of State, James Baker, in his account of his discussions with Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, reports having stated, "There would, of course, have to be ironclad guarantees that NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward." But this assurance was centered around the Soviet fear of a resurgent, and possibly nuclear-armed, Germany. Robert Zoellick, a U.S. State Department official involved in the negotiations, says very clearly that no formal commitment was made to limit NATO's expansion. Western divisions. According to the BBC, a source at the Élysée Palace said Russia had made a commitment not to take any new military initiatives to enable a potential de-escalation. This is tantamount to agreeing that Russia is in control of this crisis and will increase or decrease tension at its discretion. On February 8, Russia's defense ministry announced 6 amphibious landing ships were heading to the Black Sea on exercise. As Putin applies greater pressure on Ukraine, a state he says is historically and culturally one with Russia, the position of NATO and Russia is increasingly polarized. The Russian position is to demand guarantees that Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO, a position that both the US and NATO have flatly rejected. The US President, Joe Biden, has stated that all nations must have freedom of action when deciding to form or join an alliance, and that NATO has an open-door policy to any European state that qualifies for membership. Ukraine does not presently qualify because of concerns over corruption, economic and democratic reform, and its inability to contribute to the collective defense of NATO. But Biden has made the US position very clear. Europe has been less clear. Eastern European nations are bolstering their military forces and some nations are sending military aid. Meanwhile, Germany refuses to sell arms and equipment to Ukraine and France is discussing a purely political solution. Sanctions against Russia are discussed with varying degrees of enthusiasm in the EU and NATO. It is on this difference in stance that Putin can exert more pressure. Russia has manufactured the crisis to intimidate NATO into abandoning Ukraine. Any compromise that leaves Ukraine further exposed or vulnerable will be a loss for NATO and a win for Russia.